in Pope Benedict's writing, especially in the encyclical Caritas in Veritate in 2009, when he was contrasting the market, which is the area we think of, free market, et cetera, and government, he makes the point that the market has this tremendous capacity for development and expansion and opportunity, et cetera, but that government's role is the pursuit of the common good. That the ultimate role of government is the common good, which is, in the compendium they talk about kind of the ideal set of circumstances in which individuals and groups within society can reach their fullest potential. That's the common good, to work for the common good. And that's the duty and responsibility of people in public office, et cetera. But the government's role in that vis-a-vis the market is to, in a way, he doesn't use this word, it's a word I use, is to constrain the market, its excesses, or the ways in which it leaves people out. Like if you're poor and vulnerable in this country and you have no money, you kind of have no role in the market. And if you're disabled, you have no role as a worker in the market, et cetera. And that government's role is to make sure that the poor and vulnerable are protected, to make sure the market's excesses don't occur, to try to limit certain sorts of extremes, et cetera. And so the two are in tension with one another. He would also argue in there this whole other area of the role of kind of what internationally they would call NGOs, non-governmental organizations. We would call nonprofits in the United States, kind of the nonprofit civic sector. Where does the Boy Scouts fit in between government and the market? Well, we have this whole enormous sector in the United States, and it's what communism didn't allow for. It had the government and kind of the individuals, and no kind of nonprofit or third sector, whatever one might want to call it. But Benedict would argue that you've got to have government to kind of constrain and limit the market and to protect people who are not going to be protected. And so its goal is the common good, whereas the market's goal is the maximization of profit and the distribution of goods, et cetera. I mean, it operates in a different way from government. Some people will say to you that the Catholic position is that there is an absolute right to property, and there are some older texts that would seem to suggest that, the right of private property, which is a big thing in American law, et cetera. The actual tradition is more nuanced than that. And in the beginning of what we call modern Catholic social teaching, if you go back to the 1890s, which was the writing of the first modern Catholic social encyclical, Rerum Novarum, we talked about the importance of private property. And that's a time when we were engaged in great industrial conflict in Europe and the United States especially, between newly organizing, unionizing workers and management or owners. And the popes in writing tried to say that workers have rights, workers need to be protected, et cetera, but that property also has rights and should be protected, et cetera. And that's true. And so sort of when I was growing up, or sort of think mid-1950s, we talked about the right of private property, but we talked about the social responsibility of those who owned property. And that was the language, for example, of a department in the Diocese of Baton Rouge where I worked. It was called the Social Responsibility Department, that you had a responsibility to use your property in a socially responsible way, and especially people were talking about your surplus property. Now the evolution that took place over the next 50 years was the popes began talking about, and the bishops began talking about a social mortgage on private property. That yes, you had your right to your private property, even if you owned 10,000 acres or 100,000 acres or whatever, but it had a social mortgage, meaning that it needed to be used for the good of the community. It needed to create jobs or have people who have an opportunity to work on the land or whatever it might be. And that if it wasn't, if it was lying fallow, if you were just holding on to it, Pope John Paul actually said this in Mexico, then government had a duty to expropriate that property, to take it away from you. Because now the way we articulate, if we talk about the universal destination of private property, the property is private, but it has a universal destiny. It's meant to help the common good of everyone. So the evolution of the concepts are that property moved from sort of this absolute private property sense to social responsibility to a social mortgage on private property. And then a realization lately, I would say in the last 20 years, that private property is important for the poor. That it's important that poor people come to own, whether it's a car or an apartment or a house or the equipment for a job or a tractor or whatever it may be, that property is important, again, to human dignity. So you go back to this theme about human dignity, being the fundamental theme in our social teaching, and realize that property is not an absolute right. Human dignity is the absolute right. It's the absolute value. Property is instrumental to that. The other thing that happened in the evolution of property is the concept of what property is evolved over the last 120 years. When we first start talking about private property, we're talking about land, because in an agrarian society, land is wealth. Then, moving into the industrial period, we talk about capital. So now it's wealth that can run a business or own a factory, whatever it is. And then later, this would be later in the 20th century, to talk about knowledge. We talk about a knowledge society, that if you don't know, if you don't have a certain level of knowledge, you don't own anything in this society. And now, sort of talking about technology, and I saw recently, like we were just talking about the digital divide between the poor and the rich, and even between richer people who tend to have landline, hardwired, faster, greater capacity access to the internet, et cetera, compared to those poor people who've managed to acquire wireless, slower access to the internet and to other technology. And so the concept of private property, and in the later writing of both John Paul II and Benedict XVI, they both talk about if you don't have access to knowledge and technology, et cetera, you're poor. And so we've expanded both our concept of how private property has a social obligation, a universal destination, and our concept of what private property is, from land now to technological access, et cetera, et cetera. Another important theme is work, how we've treated work. We started with, in the height of the Industrial Revolution, well, you can go way back to Thomas Aquinas and others saying that if you didn't have work and you didn't have money, et cetera, you had the right to steal. This is a little bit back to the theme about property. But we always thought there was an importance about work. But by 1891, when Pope Leo XIII writes, he articulates what we now call a family wage principle, that the worker should be entitled to a family wage, which roughly was defined as enough to support a worker and his family. It was generally thought to be the guy, the father, and his family in modestly decent circumstances. Now, over the last 120 years, we've moved from talking about a family wage to saying it's not just wages now, it's wages plus retirement, health insurance, unemployment compensation for those who are thrown out of work, workers' compensation for people who are injured on the job, protection of people who cannot work because they're disabled, or they've been injured on the job, or they're raising children, small children, which is the whole welfare debate. So we've really expanded our sense that work should support the worker and, now we'd say, his or her family and their needs, and in the very latest writing, their futures, so that there's enough to invest to send kids to college or whatever it may be. That's all very important. Now, John Paul II, though, expands the work thing with a whole spiritual dimension in 1981 in his encyclical on human work, Laborem Exercens. He works out of the book of Genesis. And he says that when God says to the man and the woman, be fruitful and multiply and occupy the earth, etc., he's saying, continue my creative activity on the earth. Be, as we now talk about, as the theologians talk about, co-creators with me. So it's not just stewards of the earth, but you're co-creating with me. And that human dignity is tied to that co-creative activity. So that unemployment then, because he writes about work, he's writing about work, unemployment then is not just an assault on the human person because I can't earn enough money to take care of myself and my family's needs. It's an assault on my person because I'm not able to engage in creative human activity. And therefore, my likeness to God is attacked and assaulted by unemployment. So it's not just a material explanation of unemployment, it's a spiritual explanation. And we know this, that people who become unemployed become depressed. They're less able to take care of their lives. Their whole sense of human dignity is eroded, etc. And so John Paul was trying to get at, it's not just the work, it's what the work means to what he calls the human person the subject of the economy, and everything else is an object. That it says, Benedict and others say, the economy is meant, and our bishops, is meant for people, not people for the economy. In general, the church took a position early on, at the time of both communism, the greater war between communism and capitalism, that was critical of both systems. And then when the wall fell in 1989 and communism collapsed, at least in Europe, et cetera, we continued our critique of the capitalist system because while it is efficient, and the writings of John Paul and others have said that, is probably the most efficient vehicle for, again, growing the economy, moving goods and services, employing people, et cetera, it had failures. It didn't take care of people who couldn't participate in the system, and it had tendencies to make some people, as we've seen recently, very, very, very rich, while other people have gotten poorer and poorer. And so one of the roles of government has always been, in the church's thinking, to moderate and to control the market. And it really goes back to the primary obligation of government, which is the common good, which is taking care, making sure that society is organized in a way that makes it possible for the most people and for each of us individually as well to try to achieve our finest human fulfillment, is what we want. And so that's the role of government. And taxes played a sub-role in that, which is that taxes were meant to try to offset some of those inequalities in the marketplace. And also to pay for services that the market doesn't necessarily pay for. And so to pay for things that promote the common good, like education and healthcare and scientific research, whatever it may be, taxes are meant to help do that. And so they are, and in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, they're a positive moral obligation on our part to pay taxes for the common good. And so when people are making out their tax return, it's not that government's stealing from me, it's that I'm actually fulfilling my moral obligation to the public, to the res publica, to support society and to take care of the poor and the elderly and the sick and national defense and whatever you may want to look at being elements of the common good in our country.
In the past, Catholic social teaching has taught us to be aware of the needs of the poor, but it hasn't always consistently told us to work with the poor. And that's a theme that's really been increasing in recent years. There's three models of relating to the least advantaged people in society. Three models of relating to the poor. One is to do things for the poor. This is the traditional model of works of charity, to give something. But it tends to entail staying a little remote from the lives of the poor. You can do things for the poor from a distance, write a check or make a contribution. A second, better model is to do things on behalf of the poor. For example, lobbying the state legislature for a more generous policy towards people in need is doing things on behalf of the poor, changing the system a little bit better to give people a chance on behalf of. But the third model, which I think is the best one, is to do things with the poor. That sometimes is risky, because sometimes it means leaving a comfortable suburb, going downtown to an inner city, and doing something hands-on, mingling with people who are less advantaged. Maybe they look a little different from us, they talk a little different from us, but that really is the most important or the deepest level of involvement with the poor. Not just charity from a distance, but doing things with the poor.